Welcome to the Time to Hire podcast.
I'm Jake Paul.
And I'm Will Ducey. Our goal with this podcast is to bring in new perspectives and ensure the recruiting function remains relevant and forward-looking.
We talk to recruiting experts, HR tech founders, and anyone who brings unconventional ideas to help push the craft of recruiting forward.
If you want to future-proof yourself and increase your impact over time through strategy, technology, and best practices, this is the podcast for you. It is time to hire.
Okay, Madeline, welcome to the Time to Hire podcast.
Thanks, Jake. Thanks for having me on.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
One of the, I think a lot of recruiters and even some recruiting leaders aren't really familiar with the role of an analyst. So we'd love for you to just sort of kick things off, kind of explaining your role, your company, what you guys do, and how you service clients, and frankly, who those clients are.
It's a great question. It's hard to talk about an analyst. I think to your point, like many people don't understand what an analyst is and what we do even in this market, but analysts do research on, for this industry, HR technology, and hopefully close the gap between what providers are selling and then what companies want to buy. So we have to do lots of demos. We have to do research through surveys. We have to do research through interviews. And then we kind of put all of that together in research reports and speaking engagements and all that fun stuff. So we're a pretty opinionated bunch, as you probably have seen. And we're, basically the goal is to be research-based and research-focused.
And is that your personal background, is research?
Yeah, it is. I went to school for international relations, which is a little odd that I got into this industry, and thought actually applied to the CIA, thought that would be kind of the path I would go as an analyst on that side. And then obviously things changed, 9/11 happened, and then I found this crazy industry of HR tech.
As I've learned the role of an analyst and having worked with them myself, it sounds like there's kind of two camps and maybe a hybrid camp, but of those that service more the vendors and help them better get the word out and communicate out to the potential buyers, and those that help buyers sort of navigate the complexity of the, what we'll get into is the sort of craziness of the HR tech market. Where do you guys at Aptitude sort of sit, or is it across that whole spectrum?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to categorize it. I think we do both. I mean, we definitely do a lot of advisory for vendors and try to understand that tech landscape, in a very in-depth way. And then at the same time, we do a lot of advisory on the corporate side as well. We don't do selection of systems. We don't implement any type of technology, but we help companies understand the landscape in a way that can help inform, what they need. And I think we do the same thing for vendors, help them understand the landscape so they can position themselves or look to build products that actually are what companies need and fit in this market.
Cool. So switching gears here, I'd love to just sort of have you give an overview of like your take on the HR tech market, kind of describe, a lot of people who are in recruiting seats or, again, recruiting leadership. I feel like we have a pretty siloed focus on the tools that we specifically care about and don't quite grasp the complexity and how massive it is. I've seen all these Lumascapes out there with just 30, 40, 50 categories of types of products. And then within each, another 30 or 40 products within those themselves. So how would you sort of summarize sort of the current state of things with our space?
It's crazy. I mean, I think I've never seen the landscape more complex. I think there are three themes that I see right now. I think the first is companies are still buying tech. They're still investing. And I think there's a lot of misperceptions around where companies are at, if hiring slowed down, if they have changes in how they're managing employee experience. People think they're not investing in tech. And we find that's the opposite. Companies are increasing their investment in all things HR technology this year, and that's going to continue next year. And that has almost made the landscape even more complex. And that's kind of the big theme. The second theme that I want to talk about is the complexity. It's like everyone's creating a new category. We've talked a little bit about this. It's like this category creation versus like just going with what the standard categories are. And, I think all of these providers are entering the market. And then at the same time, existing providers and more traditional providers, even on-premise providers, are completely reinventing themselves. Like I just had a call with a company that is traditionally an HRIS, and they want to now completely reinvent themselves as an insights and analytics company. I mean, that's near and dear to your heart. But it's, it's so both of those things are happening at the same time. We have new companies entering the market and then old companies reinventing themselves to be every single thing to every single person and every single company. So it's crazy complex. And then I think the third thing is like AI is the topic. It's not going anywhere. And companies are really confused about it, but they're definitely embracing it more than they were a year ago.
So when it comes to the category creation, and there's this clear appetite for vendors who want to be sort of break through the noise of this complexity of the market by being a new category, by trying to define a new thing. I think there's a lot of talk around that, but the actual reality and the practicality of what they're really building is kind of more the same, but just spun in a different way.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, how often do you really see new categories get created when it really comes down to the meat and bones of it?
I think that's so well said. I think so often it's not a new category. It's just we want to be new, we want to be different, or we want to be the first. Like there's this intense obsession with being the first. Like we're the first provider, we're the only provider. We're the one provider that does this. And I see that in a lot of messaging. And I just don't think it really matters as much as providers think it does. So I think not a lot of it is true category creation. I think it's just either a change in marketing messaging or this desire to be able to say the first provider. I mean, I've seen so many providers say we are the first AI provider in HR tech. And it's like, actually, you're not. And AI has been used for a long time. But to me, there's just this crazy obsession with being the first. And I don't think it really matters to the buyer at all. And I think, the other thing, like we talked a little bit about, is there a visual? Like, is there some type of visual to categorize this market? And it's been really challenging as an analyst to come up with an image, a model to be used. I mean, we definitely have one within talent acquisition that we use as a framework. We have one for broader HR. But I started like plotting logos, for years. We started this a long time ago. And this year, I just kind of threw up my hands and said, forget it, because everybody overlaps with new categories. It's hard to figure out where some providers go at all. There's just too many providers. And I feel like when I look at what we've done, it looked more confusing than actually value add.
Yeah, and I think that's to your earlier comment about the HRIS that's now getting into analytics. It's like, where do you even put them, right? Because and I think that's driven by this, appetite for expansion and getting into new spaces, and then all of a sudden you go to a company's website and they themselves have a challenging time communicating what they actually do. So I don't know, how do you see that playing itself out? Is the dust ever going to settle in this confusion?
I think it has to a little bit. Like during the pandemic, people were just buying like crazy, right? It was like, let's just buy everything. We don't care if it fits a category. We don't care if it integrates with anything else. We just have endless budget in talent acquisition anyway, and we're going to buy things. And that's not the case today. So the buying behavior has to change because the budgets have shifted a little to be a little more strategic around what are you buying. You can't just buy everything. You can't just buy all these new things. There has to be a bigger plan. So, I think companies have to be more strategic. I almost think the fault is on both the providers and then on the companies as well. I mean, it's easy to blame companies and say, you need to be more thoughtful about what you're buying and how you're using it. And if you have no idea what you bought, you need to be more thoughtful of that. But also vendors are reinventing themselves and they're changing their products. They're promising things on a roadmap that are never delivered. And what they often think they're buying, they're actually not buying. So the confusion is from both sides, I think.
Yeah, and it's a little chicken or egg because you're right, especially within TA, they're always chasing the next shiny object. And they're able to because, it's almost like the bulk of their products that they buy don't really extend beyond, and this is my take at least, I'm curious how you think about this, but it's like the software lives within their team and it doesn't really touch the rest of the organization. So it's not as broad of a buying decision process. It's like, okay, here's a cool new sourcing tool. Let's try that one out this year. And the buyers are chasing that. And so it's like, of course, if the money's going to follow those brand new point solutions, then I think it's understandable that the companies are trying to kind of chase that tail.
Yeah, they're chasing the tail. And I think it's, and I think where companies have settled with the ATS, it's like, okay, We know what the ATS does. We find less dissatisfaction with the ATS than I saw like 10 years ago, because it's like, okay, we know what the ATS does. We know it's just a workflow. We know it's just this bread and butter. And now we have to buy cool things to improve the experience, to give us analytics, to help us, get to this idea of talent intelligence. And that, I think companies are then looking at, okay, what is that? And we're hearing that from all these different providers. So they're just buying all these point solutions versus what they should be doing, which is, okay, stick with your ATS, buy a talent intelligence platform or kind of some layer there, and then look at what you need in your ecosystem.
Yeah, it's a good segue to my next sort of section here around tool consolidation and the appetite for that. And so I think you've got the non-system of records, like trying to become that full uniform layer that sits on top of it. But then you also, at the same time, have ATSs out there trying to get that revenue that's coming in for these solutions that are making their own platform better. And it's going to be really interesting. I'm curious what your take is on this. I'm like, who wins the day? Does everybody have to be on a path to become an ATS? Or is this world of layered technology on top of that core system going to persist?
Yeah, it's I think about this a lot, actually. And I think the layered, that's going to continue. I think that's what companies are doing. And I think that we're going to see that continue. I think the ATSs are trying to be that cool layer, whatever that might be, experience layer, talent intelligence layer, whatever they want to call it. But I don't see that really happening. And there's a lot to be said for focus from providers, like providers that are truly focused on what they do and what they do well. And there's value in that. So I think we're going to still see that there's, a very strong ecosystem in our industry of solutions that are point solutions that companies buy. But the consolidation is interesting because I think we are going to see companies say, we want less tools. But it's going to be what do they invest in and where are the priorities? And I thought we would, if you asked me in January, are we going to see companies investing in less and looking at more consolidation in the tools that they're using? I would have said absolutely. There's no question, hiring's changed, we're just changing how we think about it. But now looking now in December, didn't really see that happen. Companies are still buying, a lot of layers or point solutions or ecosystem providers. And I think that's going to happen for next year too.
What's driving that appetite for tool consolidation, right? I would imagine if your reference to this being asked this question in January, that's probably primarily budget, but then and obviously simpler buying process, less contracts to deal with. But on the actual user side, the arguments are less logins, less toggling between tabs. But what's actually going to carry the weight in that drive for an appetite to consolidate?
I think what would drive that would be all of those things. I think there's consistency. I mean, budget's still going to play a factor, but I think there's got to be some consistency in an experience, and that's less logins. That's, being able to feel like this is familiar and this is where you're spending your time. And then there's consistency in data and consistency in even support. I think we saw that a lot with companies this year, and even during the pandemic. It's just being able to have dedicated support from your provider and know who is going to be available to you, that goes a long way. So I think I think consistency is the big driver for that. One thing that's been really interesting that I've noticed, I don't know if you've noticed the same thing. I mean, you have a lot of connections on the corporate TA side, but it almost feels like there's this almost resume building aspect to investing in technology where TA leaders or even HR leaders are like, okay, we saw a lot of people shift jobs, change careers, move to different industries within talent acquisition and say, okay, if I want to look at my own personal career and, me, Madeline, wants to be able to build a really strong resume and work for a really great company next year, it's going to look really good if I implement 4 big systems this year. And that's personal. That's not just what the benefit is for the company, but I want to embrace technology. And if I'm a tech champion and I know how to go through this very difficult implementation stage, I'm going to look really interesting as a transformer to other companies that might be looking for a TA leader.
So given the complexity that we've described and how everything's just changing so fast, if I'm a head of talent and, I'm not deep in the weeds of the market like someone like you, and I know that I have a few problems in my processes that I need to go find a solution for. Where do I even start? Because we do a lot of analysis on where buyers, learn about us, and it's anywhere from Googling to, the majority is word of mouth to the ATS platform and their ecosystem. But do you have any pro tips on help and how somebody should go about their buying process to, I guess, first of all, even understand what their options are?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think everything you said is great. There's no wrong answer. So the more that you do and invest in that due diligence piece, the better. So all of those options that you just laid out are the right places to start too. Look at the ATS ecosystem, look at, what some of your competitors might be using for different technology providers. I always say start internal too. Sometimes I call it journaling, but I don't mean Dear Diary. It's how do you look internally and look at different people within your organization, different stakeholders. What have they used at past companies? What are they using today? What are they familiar with? What did they like? And start to just take note internally. I think that's also a good place to start. And then I think the beauty of HR tech is that people share their experiences. So whether that's going to conferences, and if you don't have a budget to attend some of the big conferences like HR Tech or Unleash, you can go on the local level and just attend local networking events. I mean, they happen in Boston all the time. I know they probably happen in the Bay Area for you all the time too. Take advantage of those local events because you can just start talking to people, ask them about the technology they're interested in, what they're using, and build almost your own support network outside of your company for, go-to people that you can rely on.
So last thing before we switch topics here, what categories are you most excited about going into 2024? And are there any specific actual products that you're also, interested to see play out?
Yeah, it's a good question. I love the generative AI stuff that's happening in our industry. And I think a lot of the use cases, not just for the employer side to be able to, everybody's talking about job descriptions, but there's a lot, beyond that can help recruiters, save them time, to help, with research, to help with communication with candidates. I think there's a lot that's great there, but I've seen a lot of different use cases for the candidate too. How do we summarize the insights that we get about a candidate and give that information to those individuals to say, okay, this is just some insights that we gathered from you that might help you in your job search. So I think I've been really excited about the generative AI stuff, and we're definitely going to be talking about that next year too. I don't think it's going anywhere. And I think, we've talked about talent intelligence. I know we're not going to talk about that today, but I could talk about that a lot too. I think it's the category that there's the most opportunity in HR technology, and it's also the category that's most misunderstood.
Why don't you bring some clarity to that? Because I do think that, it's one of those things that I think a few years ago was a little buzzwordy, and it kind of seemed to be all encompassing. And I've talked to even people recently who have very different definitions of it. So what would you say is the sort of unified definition of talent intelligence as the market is today?
Yeah, I think it's a couple things. I think it has to be skills based and AI driven. I think talent intelligence is looking at the full picture of your workforce, whether you're talking about recruiting and you're thinking about recruiting externally, or you're thinking about internal mobility. You're getting a clear picture of your workforce. It's almost I've heard people describe it as the GPS. It's not just taking data, which a system of record would do. It's giving you the insights to direct you into the decisions that you're making. And I think the other piece of it, and I think people differ. Go ahead.
Decisions around hiring decisions or internal mobility or employment, all of the above.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think it depends on how companies are using it and who's using it. But I think, it's not just something for talent acquisition. For talent intelligence is being talked about a lot with internal mobility. It's being talked about, even with some contingent workforce and strategic workforce planning initiatives. So I think, I think that's where the potential is. This is an opportunity to really be the backbone and, the backbone of our talent strategy, or the backbone of what we're investing in for our technology roadmap. So I think there's a lot there, but the confusion is everybody's using it. It's still buzzwordy, right? It's something everybody's talking about. They're still using. It's any provider that just has data. ATSs call themselves talent intelligence platforms. CRMs do. And they're not necessarily the best.
Yet another example of the complexity of of all the buzzy things out there.
Yeah.
Okay, so would love to switch gears and dive into your latest report that you released, which is, as you said, part of your job doing research and going deep on various topics. And this one's called Recruitment and Retention, Two Sides of the Same Coin. Could you kick us off and just give an overview of kind of what was the focus of this research and just generally some of the findings? And then I've got a few what I thought were pretty fascinating insights that I'd love to dive deeper on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a little skeptical, like I started this project because I was like, what is this going to be? Like, what are we going to find with the research? It seems maybe either obvious or something people wouldn't want to talk about. But I was surprised at how popular the topic was when we started doing the survey and then started doing the interviews. And I think the whole premise of it, one reason we did it was like, because companies view these as two completely separate initiatives. Like you're recruiting, and that's part of talent acquisition, and you're recruiting basically just to fill a position as quickly and cost effectively as possible. And then you've got retention, which is looking at, okay, how do we keep the right people within our organization? And they're completely separate initiatives. But when recruiting is done well, like you're actually recruiting for retention, you're recruiting for quality of hire. I mean, it's a topic we've talked a lot about, and you're recruiting essentially for retention. And this whole retention conversation needs to happen right in the beginning. That gets after quality of hire, but it's also a metric that the more that we dove into the research, it's like, it's not this static metric that's just, how long did somebody stay in 90 days? How long did they stay for the first, like who stayed for the first year? It's really about, okay, what does retention lead to? It leads to productivity. It leads to performance. It leads to, a better experience. It leads to quality of hire. So this whole idea of retention became much broader than just, what's the percentage of your employees that you're keeping, you're staying within your company. So it was, I think that's kind of the premise, is how do we link and align recruitment and retention?
Got it. And that's music to my ears because I'm probably going to say this on every second or third episode. It baffles me that the TA side of the house and the HR side of the house are such different teams, systems, and sets of data, and they don't talk. And if you want to improve retention from a recruiting standpoint, recruiters need to know what's going on the other side of the house. They need to know how are people not being retained, where can we improve it, and what are the profiles of folks that are actually staying and succeeding. And there's this brick wall that I have in my mind that I just want to knock down, and I'm convinced that it's going to happen, but it's just taking a lot longer than expected. So, awesome.
And to that point too, like, one thing that we found, I don't know if it was this study or it's like even when we did a few years ago, it was such a low percentage of recruiters that had access to retention data at their company. It's like, do you know the percentage of, like, what's your retention numbers at your company? They didn't know. I mean, it's not a secret. Like everyone should know that at the company, but recruiting teams have no insight into, to your point, that post-hire data.
Right. Whether it's all of the entire organization's retention rates, or even just them, myself as a recruiter, I want to know how are my people that I helped hire doing. And unless you're retaining a good relationship with that new employee, which is hard to do because we're kind of off in a bubble as a recruiting team, and it's like focusing on hires, and as soon as they're hired, it's on to the next one. But yeah, it's just interesting to see how this evolves, and I think tools and technology, and I think the industry needs to almost catch up with what's out there.
Yeah.
So first thing that sort of jumped out at me as I was reading through the report was this data point that says, when asked who is most responsible for employee retention, 82% of your survey respondents say that HR teams are most responsible for retention, and number 2 was 60% with managers. Number 3 was 58% with executives, then recruiting, then employees. And it's just like, man, poor HR teams. People leave it. In my opinion, the high level buckets of why people leave is because they have a shitty or incompetent manager.
Yep.
They don't believe in the vision or the capabilities of the executive team, or the company culture is just either not a fit or it's objectively toxic. And I don't know which one of those things HR business partners are responsible for driving and owning. They can help triage it when they're going wrong, but it's like, executives are the ones going with the vision, and, managers are solely responsible for their employees. And it's like, how are they getting roped into being so responsible for so many different things? And, I feel sorry for TA on a certain degree, but reading this, I was like, geez, poor HR folks. Yeah.
I thought the same thing. I mean, it is managers. I mean, we found career development was like a big driver of retention too. But I mean, I think, for a lot of, we've all experienced this, a bad manager is, number one, that's going to make you leave your company for sure. And then what does HR have to do with that? I mean, I almost wonder if recruiting sees this and they're like, I don't want anything to do with this. Like, I do not want to be responsible for retention. Has nothing to do with me. And that's why there's this resistance to think about it during the recruitment process.
Yeah, and that's why there's also the debate about who owns quality of hire, right?
Exactly.
Quality of hire is at the core retention and performance. And, I could make the argument for both sides of the coin, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of different reasons and places where things can go wrong and where things can succeed. And I think the hesitance on the recruiters is that they're confident they hired the right person, but it's not up to them to onboard them adequately, give them a great hiring manager and team experience. They have some controls, but to really be the sole owner, I think, it's a topic for debate.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, the recruiters are being held accountable for so many things, so many more things than they were before, that it's almost like this is not my responsibility. But quality of hire is, and we both know that. And so it's like, how do you, again, recruit for retention?
And you do that by starting to collaborate better with HR and TA and become one sort of unified team and data and systems. Okay, the second one that really jumped off the page at me was 70% of companies stated that talent acquisition is still viewed as a cost center.
Yeah.
And, my last recruiting gig was in 2018. And it felt like we were getting some pretty good momentum from going from, paper pushing, resume shuffling, I don't know, call it what you will, cost center type work to where we're sitting down and talking to executives and getting strategic, and we've got everybody at the table and everyone's involved. So it's just pretty jarring to see that, which tells me there's very little traction happening despite companies, and also through the recession, not recession, but through the downturn that we've had. Yeah. Really seeing the importance and the meaningfulness of hiring the right people and getting it right, and the cost of hiring the wrong people, and yet TA is still not elevated to be seen as that strategic business partner. So what's your takeaway from that, and why do you think that number is still so high?
It's so jarring, and it's not to say that TA is not a priority or a business priority. We know it is. Like, we know companies and CEOs care about who they're hiring.
There's money going towards it.
There's money going towards it. Yeah. But why is it viewed as not strategic? And I think, honestly, the reason I think is because I think companies have no idea what recruiters do. I think if you asked a CEO, if you asked managers what recruiters do, they don't know how difficult the job is. They don't know how difficult it is to find quality talent, to measure quality of hire, to be able to compete for talent in a very competitive market. They don't understand what recruiters do. And I think Tim Sackett says this quote all the time, but it's the one job that everybody thinks that they can do better at the company. Everybody thinks, I could do it. Like, I could do it so much better. Like, I'd find people. Like, I didn't see this posted on Indeed. Like, why are we not posting these jobs on Indeed? So, I think, to me, when I see that, it's not necessarily something that is, ill-spirited. I think it's more that there's a real lack of understanding of what recruiters did and do. And we did a big study during the pandemic on recruiter experience, and it was like shocking to me, first, how popular that report was, because I think it was a validation for recruiters to be like, okay, like, this is a topic we want to talk about. And I think the other piece of it was just how companies don't know. I mean, we even asked that question, like, is it harder to fill positions this year than last? We know 2021, it was harder, right? Like, everybody knows that. Or 2020, it was harder. And when we looked at the survey data and we cut it by recruiter responses, HR leader responses, and IT's response to the survey data, and we had like 80% of recruiters, I forget the exact percentage, said that it's harder to fill positions this year than last year. Somewhere around 60% of HR leaders said it's harder. And then 10% of IT professionals said it's harder because they don't know. It's not that they don't want to give recruiters what they need. They just don't know.
Well, they probably are looking at a simple metric of, well, there's more candidates out in the market today. So of course it's easier because it's, easy. It's just a matter of picking the best one, as opposed to, when in a tighter market, when it's much fewer candidates, it's all about luring them away from their existing roles. So I get it on the surface, but yeah, it's one of those things where recruiters need to do, and recruiting leadership needs to do a better job of, I don't know if managing up is the right word, but basically showcasing what they're doing. Because again, when leadership doesn't actually see the work other than the just total hiring numbers and the people that show up on their first day, for whatever reason, probably because of this cost center perception, they just assume the worst and assume that they're not doing anything and assume that it's easy. And so it's a frustrating challenge. Yeah. Which is a good segue to the last one that I picked up on, which is, I don't think I've seen it this high before, and certainly as the front runner, but basically quality of hire being the number one initiative, across improve overall decision making, improving D&I, and increase candidates' trust. So quality of hire was 65%, overall decision making, which you could argue is kind of bundled a little bit with quality of hire, quality of hiring decisions, at being at 51%, D&I is 45%. One side question: how did D&I evolve from previous years? Is 45 an increase, or are we seeing that drop?
Sadly, like we're seeing that drop.
I mean,
and I think a lot of other analysts are seeing the same thing. I know providers are seeing that as well. It's very unfortunate. I think like when we did this, we ask this every year. So it's been like decades like that we've asked this question. But in 2020, it was efficiency, right? Like number one, everything was just efficiency, time to hire, time to fill a position. We're number one. And that's not a bad thing. Like we need efficiency. But DE&I was right up there, and that was the big priority. And now we're looking, almost 4 years later, and to see that drop so significantly, it's disheartening. And I think it's, I think for a lot of companies, it was just reaction for them for 2020, which is unfortunate. And I think for other companies, what they were hoping to get from their tech providers to support D&I, they didn't get. And, the companies have to do the work. Technology is not going to come in and help you with your culture. So it has to be both things. And I don't know exactly why we're seeing such a significant drop, but I think companies really need to think more strategically about it.
Yeah, I think it shows a lot of their sort of true colors on the reason behind why they were putting so much money behind D&I as an initiative. And anyway, that's a whole separate topic that we could unpack. But on the quality of hire stuff, what's your, from talking to your clients and just, having a pulse on the industry, what's driving that? And why has that become, a pretty significant leader across these categories as far as initiatives?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we saw it last year too. At the end of last year, I was like, okay, this is going to be the big topic, is quality of hire.
And it's not a new concept either, right?
It's not a new concept. No, it's always like what we've been talking about. And I think, it's that holy grail of like what TA should be and how it should be measured. And companies have really struggled with how to, that's like they've struggled with how to measure it and how to think about it. But I think, for companies that looked at like, okay, we're not hiring as much, they kind of have the luxury to take a step back and say, okay, how do we make sure that quality is the focus if the numbers aren't what they used to be? So there's a nice piece to slowing down, which is like, okay, we can really put some more thought into what the strategy, what the goal of TA is, which is quality of hire. So I think that's part of it. And I think the other piece is, all eyes were on TA during the pandemic, and a lot of decisions were made really quickly around technology, around decisions around talent, around salaries, around compensation that just did not sustain and can't be sustained as we look to move forward. So we have to take a step back and say what really does matter. If we put in a framework around quality of hire now, that's going to help us even when we hit times of uncertainty to be able to say, this is what our TA function is built on. And I think companies get that. They get that. They just haven't had a way to do it before. And now the good news is, you're a testament to this, is there's options to do it. We don't have to sit there and make something up in a room. Like there are providers that are completely supporting this. You don't have to do the hard work.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see how this, as the years progress. And as you're talking, I was just wondering okay, yes, it's ramping up. And part of that reason could be because there's a perceived influx or a real influx of high quality talent out there. And they want to make sure that we're choosing the best people. And I'm thinking, okay, as boom times hopefully come back again, maybe not quite like 2020, but does that then fall to the wayside? And is it just all about, butts and seats again and just growth for the sake of growth? But on the product front, though, we were both at HR Tech, and it feels like this is another one of those talent intelligence-y kind of buzzwords that everyone's trying to slap on their products, and everyone has an angle for how we're improving your quality of hire.
Yeah.
How do you assess that market? Because I think I've seen a scheduling app talk about improving quality of hire, right? Like all the way to a real quality of hire platform. So how would you navigate that, or how would you describe that landscape?
It's the same. I think it's the same thing. It's a priority. Like everyone wants it, but it's so confusing. I even saw like providers completely outside of TA talking about quality of hire or using that as a metric for what they do. I think it's confusing. So I think companies have to do your due diligence and like figure out what providers have, expertise in this area. Like even when I think about how we evaluate as analysts, like understanding if a provider truly has expertise, if this is truly what they're offering, if this is their focus area, you have to look at the full picture. You have to look at the company, like how is this company made? What's the heritage of the company? What is the focus of the leadership team? Like what's their priority? How much investment have they taken? Look at the company itself, then you look at the product. And asking about product roadmap is so relevant. Like a lot of companies don't ask that. Ask about product roadmap. Even if it's not set in stone, if a provider is willing to share with you what their vision is, it's very telling, because all these roadmaps are just going buzzword to buzzword to buzzword to buzzword. It's like whatever buzzword they hear, they're changing the whole roadmap to just address that. So I think it's, asking questions around roadmap consistently is really important. And then thinking about what the differentiators are. Like how do we, as buyers, like really understand what these differentiators are from the providers and make decisions based on that versus just hearing their buzzwords.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because, the data shows that the vast majority of TA teams have quality of hire, and just measuring it as a big priority for next year. Well, if you're a vendor that, is doing some tangential part of the process and claiming that we improve quality of hire, to your point, ask that question and say, okay, how do you know? I mean, half of the industry is not even measuring it yet. So where's the data behind how the impact? So
I know, I think it's such a good point. And I think like if you look at the ATSs, I think we've talked about this, like the ATSs measure quality of hire by did somebody accept an offer? That has nothing to do with quality. That's just it has nothing to do with anything. Literally, it's just somebody accepted an offer. That doesn't mean it's quality of hire, but a lot of the ATS will give you a quality of hire metric on a dashboard that's just based on offer acceptance.
Yep, exactly. Well, this was great. Thank you, Madeline.
Thank you.
Yeah, hope to have you back and go deeper on some other topics. But thanks again. Sorry Will wasn't here, but next time it'll be the three of us.
We'll get him on. Awesome. Thanks, Jake.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye.